everybody. My name is Richard Dahl. I am a legal writer with FindLaw here at Thomson Reuters. Today we're going to be talking about voting rights, voter law, and my guest today is David Schultz, who is a professor of political science at Hamline University. He also teaches at the University of Minnesota School of Law and University of St. Thomas School of Law, at both places where he teaches election law.
Thank you for having me.
Sure. The first question I have for you today is, once you said that voting rights are the most important rights that we have. Why do you say that?
I say that because the right to vote is the right that protects all other rights that we have. It starts with being able to use the right to vote to protect the whole range of Bill of Rights and other protections that we deem important in a democracy.
Could you provide some background on your own information, how you came to develop an interest in election law?
Well, it's actually kind of interesting. The pattern for it is that I've been a political scientist for many years. I went back later in life and did a law school myself because I got interested in the topic. And ever since I was an undergraduate, I was always interested in the question of democracy and political participation. How do we ensure that people have a voice in their political system? And as I went to law school myself, I became interested in topics like constitutional law. I became interested in First Amendment issues and really started thinking about, well, where in our Constitution does it talk about a right to vote? And one of the things that I realized is that our original Constitution doesn't have language about voting rights, doesn't talk about the right to vote, at least explicitly. And that's how it started, to understand the relationship between democracy and election law. The way I describe it, election law is the body of law that puts democracy into action. And if that's the case, voting is a central component of election law, all about who gets to express their views, who gets to have input, who gets to have say over so many things. And so it's really been kind of a progression over many, many years in terms of, again, thinking about that interrelationship between democracy, elections, individual rights.
I think people would be surprised to learn that our Constitution says nothing about actual voting right. Is that what your interpretation would be?
Well, it is, and actually, and I have my little pocket version of the Constitution here, and when I teach my students, I sometimes start off by saying, well, help me find in the original Constitution where it says there's a right to vote. And they'll kind of open it up and they'll flip through it and they'll say, can't find it. And I said, I know you can't. And they said, why not? And I said, take us back to 1787. There were major disagreements at the Constitutional Convention over a whole host of issues. Some of us might remember the debates between the big states and the small states in terms of representation, also between the slave states and the free states. And these major disagreements basically pushed the constitutional framers of 1787 to say, well, maybe there are some issues we're not going to address at the federal level, but we're going to leave these as part of a state issue. And that's exactly what happened. In 1787, when the original Constitution was written, the framers basically had nothing in there about voting rights and left it up to the individual states to determine eligibility. Now, this is not a complete surprise, because remember, the United States is the first of, if we're going to call it a democracy, or the first aristocratic, non-kingdom in the world, whatever it may be. And I say that because the idea, even then, of saying people have the right to vote, that's a pretty radical idea, even by those standards. But if we look at our original Constitution, think about how it was set up. States got to decide who got to vote, but in the federal Constitution, remember at that time, we couldn't vote for the president. It was the Electoral College. Mm-hmm. And that's still true to this day. There's no right to vote for President of the United States. We don't have a right to vote for the Supreme Court. That's then or now. And under the original Constitution, there was no right to vote even for senators. So if we looked at a lot of the Constitution didn't give us a right to vote in our federal elections. Any voting rights we had were left up to the states to determine. And in 1787, who could vote? As I like to tell my students, white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant males with money, which means they were property holders, and over the age of 21. And that's basically what the state laws were saying.
Mm-hmm. So in the absence of a mention of voting rights in the Constitution, what are the laws that govern voting rights in the U.S.?
Well, a couple things have happened. First off, thinking about it in terms of 1787, we've undergone a pretty dramatic revolution over about a 230-year period. That since that time, we have now adopted numerous constitutional amendments. Amendments that gave at one point freed slaves the right to vote, then women the right to vote, then a law that said that we have a right to vote for senators. During the Vietnam War era, it was lowering the voting age to 18 years old from 21. So we have a whole host of constitutional amendments that have sort of given us the right to vote. And I say sort of, because if you actually read the language of the Constitution, it still doesn't say we have an affirmative right to vote. It says, for example, the right to vote shall not be denied on account of race or age or again, the amendment uses this language, or sex. It's kind of a negative right. So we've got a host of constitutional amendments that have expanded franchise. We also have the Voting Rights Act at the federal level that has guaranteed the right to vote and has protected the right to vote. And then there's been obviously a whole bunch of Supreme Court decisions. Eventually, the U.S. Supreme Court has said that Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution, if I can look at it here, Article 1, Section 2 says, the House of Representatives shall be composed of members chosen every second year by the people. Mm-hmm. The Supreme Court has said that clause guarantees us a right to vote at the federal level. The Supreme Court has also said the First Amendment gives us a right to vote at the state and local level. So through a combination of constitutional amendments, through some judicial precedent interpretation, through some statutory law, we've constructed something that looks like a right to vote, but still not in the way we would see in other countries where it would explicitly say there's a right to vote.
Mm-hmm. Now, there was the Supreme Court decision 6 years ago, which undermined the Voting Rights Act. Would that be fair to say? Is that the right verb to use?
Let's talk about what the Voting Rights Act did. Voting Rights Act of 1965 was a major piece of legislation. And I say that because even though the 15th Amendment was adopted after the Civil War, supposedly to give freed slaves, at that time, African Americans, the right to vote, we lived through a long era called the Jim Crow era, where states found a variety of ways of keeping African Americans from voting. For example, the most explicit ones would have been what? Through the Klan. The Ku Klux Klan would have lynched people who tried to vote. But then we had things, for example, like poll taxes that said, well, you could vote if you paid a small fee, or you had to pass a test, some kind of a test to be able to vote, or you could only vote if your grandfather could vote. So we had all these mechanisms in place that essentially kept African Americans from voting. The 65 Civil Rights Act basically put in place a series of legal mechanisms that dramatically expanded the ability of African Americans to vote. By how? By bringing the federal government in to enforcing voting rights. And it was a tremendous success, no question about it. But in a famous Supreme Court decision from a few years ago, what the Supreme Court said is that the formula for which jurisdictions the Voting Rights Act could apply to, that formula was out of date and struck it down as unconstitutional. And that was dramatic because it undercut one of the major enforcement provisions for arguably one of the most important voting rights protections, mechanisms in the United States.
What has been the effect of that decision?
Well,
have we
immediately,
seen?
immediately after that provision of the Voting Rights Act was struck down by the courts, we saw states, for example, try to strengthen their voter ID laws. We saw some states trying to, for example, also make it more difficult to register, or close polling places, or trim back on other registration or other ID or other ways of facilitating voting. And the way I described it is that we're really in a really interesting battle right now over voting rights in America. We've really got two traditions in the United States. One tradition that has been about the dramatic expansion of the right to vote and to help more people be able to vote. But at the same time, there's been this kind of ugly underside of trying to prevent people, to suppress votes. And over time, it's been the two major parties have at various times in their history have engaged in doing that. And we're at a struggle right now. We're at a struggle now where in many places of the United States, there are efforts to try to prevent certain people from voting, in part because our political system is so polarized. It's so closely balanced between the two major parties that affecting just a small number of votes can turn and change an election. Think about 2016. Had roughly 85,000 votes gone the other way in 3 states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, Hillary Clinton would be president of the United States and not Donald Trump. And without taking sides, I just merely mentioned, think about that, 85,000 votes is all it took in terms of moving an election from one way or the other. And look to see in 2020, it's going to be, again, a small number of votes that are going to determine the next president.
I have heard people say that the voter ID laws are unconstitutional. Is that a valid question?
The voter ID laws were upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court back in 2008 in a case called Crawford versus Marion. And since then, a lot of states have adopted some voter ID laws. Some have been struck down if it can be shown, actually can be shown that these laws place a severe burden on voting rights. And that's the standard that the court is looking at here. That the court's going to say that if a voting law is a normal administrative regulation with the purpose of trying to, let's say, address voter fraud, or if its purpose is routine administration. But if, on the other hand, it places a severe burden, makes it difficult for people to vote, it's unconstitutional. And what we've seen is the federal courts, but more importantly, many state courts using their own state constitutions, and almost all state constitutions have an affirmative right to vote clause in there. If the voter ID laws act in such a way that make it, again, a severe burden, make it too difficult to get, let's say, the requisite IDs or requisite information you need to get your voter ID, the courts have been striking down some of those laws.
Mm-hmm. How valid are arguments that there has been voter fraud at polls?
For the most part, we're in what I call the Powerball zone. And what I mean by that, we've got pretty good empirical data that says that your chances of showing that in-person voter fraud has overturned or has affected the outcome of an election, the probability of that occurring is about the same as you buying a ticket and winning Powerball. And we've got repeated studies, and this has been the subject of my research for years, is looking at what do we really know about it. That the instances of, again, in-person voter fraud, showing up, claiming that you're somebody else, trying to intentionally vote when you know you're not eligible to vote, is literally negligible in our system. And just think about it from, let's say, a big picture scenario. We have, at our best, in a presidential election year, about 55% of the American eligible population shows up to vote for president. I was always fascinated with how do we reconcile the fact that barely half of us vote with this counterclaim that says people are willing to scramble to vote and commit a felony in order to be able to affect an outcome of an election. Those two images just don't fit together. And so we do have numerous studies and official reports that have largely debunked the voter fraud argument.
So why is it important to vote?
Why is it important to vote? Well, I heard a new good line the other day. Someone said to me, if you don't vote, that means you voted for the winner. And I thought that was a really interesting line, that if you don't show up to vote, then automatically whoever won is essentially the person you voted for. But if you don't vote, you don't get a chance to have your say in terms of who's president or senator or representative. You don't get your ability to talk about who may be your city council member. If you don't vote, you lose the ability to be able to protect your own interests. Remember, again, part of our criticism when we were still a British colony is when we said taxation without representation, the British said, oh no, you have representation. You can't vote for your representative, but we in England can well speak for you. I'm not sure how many of us think that somebody else can speak for us. The only way we can speak for ourselves is when we speak for ourselves and when we cast our own votes. And so it is, whether it's symbolic, whether it's a self-interest, whether it is civic duty, there's a whole host of reasons why we should vote. And even if you think it doesn't matter in one election, in a different election, your right to vote and your actual vote could influence and have an impact on the political process.
I know we're just about out of time here, but I wanted to ask one question about voter registration. Do you have any thoughts about how that could be improved?
Well, sure. The best evidence we have is that if we actually did day of election registration, where people like in Minnesota can show up on election day and register to vote then, we know that states that do something like that have the highest voter turnout rates in the country. Because it makes it easier for people to show up and vote. It makes it easier for people who have just moved, for students who have just gone off to school, for people who have moved from, let's say, one house or one apartment to another. The day of election registration is one of the absolute best ways to increasing voter registration and turnout, as is, we're seeing in the last few years, letting people early vote. That's helped a lot. Now, I want to throw something else out here. My students always turn to me and say, well, it would be great if I could vote on my cell phone. It would be great if I could vote on my iPad. And their question being, well, why don't we have digital voting? And then I turn to them and I say, how comfortable would you be with the idea that if you were voting online, it wouldn't be hacked by some hacker? I don't think we're going to get to that point in the near future. So digital voting, online voting is probably not going to work, but early voting, day of election registration are great tools.
Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Appreciate it.
Yep, thank you.
For more information on voting rights, please feel free to go to FindLaw and use that search term, voting rights, and you can also contact Professor Schultz via his email.